Good old Microsoft, a multinational. They give us lots of information if we've got 100,000 employees, and they did a huge amount of work on SharePoint 2013 to scale up to that, 100, 200,000 employees, without really thinking about, us small customers that need the tiny farm in comparison to, someone like Boeing or someone like that in the US. That Microsoft did a huge amount of work around that scalability, which unfortunately has burdened us when we try and build our SharePoint farms. So probably deployed maybe 20 or 30 farms this year. Most customers would have at least 3 SharePoint farms, so they multiply very quickly. So I thought I'd share some of the experience that we've found in trying to kind of minimize the licensing impact on customers. So they don't need a whole lot of servers, but what are some of the trade-offs we have to make and squashing that down to a New Zealand-sized farm that's going to meet, some of our requirements. Just interested, show of hands, how many people here have deployed SharePoint 2013 already? Okay, so quite a few of you, probably just over half. I won't ask at the moment how that's going or if you've got any challenges with performance or anything, but feel free to talk to me afterwards. Obviously, I've only got a 15-minute session after this and a couple of hundred slides to get through, so I'll be talking fast and then going where they want me to go to wherever the speaker's meant to go afterwards, so feel free to come and talk to me there rather than afterwards, because we've got to make room for the next speaker to come and get set up as well. So quick agenda for today, going to look at the hosting options in general. I was talking about 4 New Zealand-sized organisations. There's still lots of different ways you could host SharePoint. Look at the on-premise specific things that we'll be talking about for most of the session. Talk about some of the the non-functional requirements specifically and how they impact the architecture of your farm. What were some of the key changes from SharePoint 2010 to 2013? If you thought you knew 2010 really, really well, it's quite different for 2013. And then into the topology options that we have and especially what some of the trade-offs there are, and hopefully a bit of time for Q&A if I can get through slides quick enough. I'm already 2 minutes in and only done first slide, so we're not looking good. So the hosting options. So everyone's, of course, shouldn't be here because you should all be using 365. Who's using SharePoint Online 365? Yeah, we've got a couple of hands coming up. Anyone want to share their experience with 365? Just quickly, you've got 30 seconds. What's your name?
Josh Morris.
Are we related?
A little bit.
I'm a Morris too. You're my son.
Hey.
Someone take a selfie, please, quickly, if you've got a cell phone. Yeah.
Basically, through my experience of being an early adopter of 365, I found that a main big purpose of it was for a company called Z Energy. We probably all use them, hopefully. They were very decentralized. Every site has a site manager with a laptop, not connected to a VPN of any kind. So we found that SharePoint was a very low, cost-efficient way of implementing any kind of processing for their stock take, drive-off sheets, anything they need to, kind of collaborate on, and that worked really well for them.
Cool. How many stations?
37.
Yep. How long have they been using SharePoint?
Since 2011.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. It's a good example of where 365 works well. But I would imagine if you've got a couple of hundred people in one building, trying to put all of your SharePoint Online in 365 might have some challenges. So it does work really well for some people in New Zealand, and we've found for other people they struggle a little bit. Certainly is the lowest cost way of getting SharePoint. Obviously got to invest in some directory integration, potentially single sign-on after that. The one thing we've found with 365 you've really got to manage quite tightly is the quota, the storage allocated to each site collection. You've got a pool effectively of storage, and you have to hard divide that up amongst your site collections or start paying. So that's kind of something we often ignore with on-premise, sometimes to our detriment when we get site collections that get too big to manage and unwieldy, but in 365 that's the thing you really got to manage quite tightly. Then obviously latency is an issue, and we've found that really with larger files. So things like Access databases, if you're trying to store them on 365 or scanned images, videos, but Microsoft project files surprisingly are really big, and if you're like a project management organisation and using lots of project files, they get surprisingly big and take a long time to open and save to SharePoint Online, so you've got to be aware of those sort of constraints. So the other kind of next option, this is one Microsoft started talking an awful lot more about, is the hybrid model, because they realised not everyone can move everything to the cloud. There are some great benefits in the hybrid model. Key one is you can give everybody their terabyte MySite, Storage in the cloud, good luck managing that. Anyone know the default behavior when one of your employees leaves the organization and they happen to have a terabyte of personal files that they may have shared externally with people? So the default behavior is that gets assigned to their manager. So whoever the manager in Active Directory is inherits ownership of somebody's my site content. So a lot of managers probably aren't interested in taking on that responsibility, but that's the only behavior option you get with 365. Sorry? Yeah, no, well, that's a good question. I don't know. They might do actually, but that still counts obviously as one of your licenses as well. So something to bear in mind. And how on earth would you know when an employee leaves, what files are in there that they may have shared externally if you enabled external sharing. So the governance around that one I think still needs quite a bit of work. The one I actually love is using Access Apps in the hybrid model. I wouldn't myself try and deploy Access Apps on premise because it needs the whole apps infrastructure, which I might not want for anything else. But if you do want Access Apps, and they are brilliant, they're really, really cool. I would use the hybrid model for that case where I just want some Access Apps deployed. I'd deploy them in the cloud because they're very web centric anyway. That would work quite well. It does give you some limited integration. Search and BCS are the two Microsoft have done the most work on, but kind of apps between on-premise and in the cloud, bit tricky. Social, again, it's isolated. Yammer, they've started doing some more integration, but for me, until I can search in SharePoint and get all content, not just federated content, but all my content in one place, you would have seen new announcements that you can start from Yammer, create a group, and have that provision a SharePoint site for you as well. Still got a little bit of little ways to go there with making it, kind of like a native SharePoint functionality where for example, my hashtags are derived from the enterprise tags in the term store. That would be really nice, but they're not at the moment. But yeah, I think for New Zealand, we've got to seriously consider the hybrid model where we can store the bulk of our content, document management things on premise, but use some of the social and apps in the cloud. So I actually have a slide where I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So the previous slide I mentioned directory synchronization that you need to do. You need to do that obviously for federation as well. And you really get the choice of, are we going to do this federation one way, either inbound, outbound, or both ways? And certainly for inbound or both ways, you need this reverse proxy concept and single sign-on. It's a little bit more complicated, and I'll talk about that a bit with the extranet as well. Some of the work there.
So if you're already paying for your license for it on-prem,
yep.
And they also do their, having the Office 365, it's going to increase your cost quite a bit.
Yep.
So what's the real driver for it? Because when it's a hyper solution, because you're social, you could do with, say, Yammer.
Yeah.
Already.
Yeah. Well, so Yammer's in the cloud, true. I mean, I still prefer personally from a knowledge management point of view to use SharePoint Social out of the box. I think it's more knowledge management, and the guy from Becker made a really good comment that Yammer's not knowledge management, whereas I think the SharePoint baked in social features are more knowledge management because it's question and answer kind of thing. You've got a topic line as well as the body. With Yammer, I've gone on lots of Yammer groups and I've got to read all these email alerts I get from Yammer. I can't tell what's good and what's bad. What's useful, what's not useful. But on your licensing question, I think the biggest value is for customers on an enterprise agreement, because what Microsoft recognises, they've already paid the SharePoint license and the Exchange license. So what you're really getting out of the cloud is you're paying an incremental small amount because you don't have to provide the hardware anymore. So if you're an EA customer, doing hybrid is almost a no-brainer because the first thing you'd move is email to the cloud. And only, I think, parts of the SharePoint workload you'd move to the cloud. So it's only a couple of dollars per user if you're a EA customer. Certainly if you're not an EA customer, yes, trying to run both is going to be more expensive. So I'm not sure what the licensing is for non-EA customers, whether Microsoft takes into account your existing, Core Cal license, but certainly for EA customers, they make it, you can negotiate with Microsoft to get a good deal if you're on an EA, which is what I'd do if I had an EA. So the private cloud option, rather than hosting all this infrastructure yourself, just get infrastructure as a service, either through government or private sector. Lots and lots of companies now make it really easy for you to fully remote set up your own, hosted private cloud environment, all through portals. VMware have made it great for for hosters to be able to set up the infrastructure and fully allow a customer to manage their own environment just through a VPN tunnel. And it gives you some good licensing options. If you're government volume licensing, you've got that license mobility option, so you buy your server licenses and your cows and you hand them over to the hoster and say, we're going to use our own licenses, you don't have to worry about that. Or you can use the SPLA licensing, which is where you pay a bit like 365, you pay per month per user for whatever service you want to host. So it becomes OPEX rather than CAPEX for that licensing if you don't already have it. But your storage costs are the thing now that is going to get you with hosting in the cloud. Normally for on-premise, all your storage costs are hidden in the big sand bucket that's already been paid for. But with SharePoint hosting in private cloud, you've got not only the space of your virtual machines, but then the storage of all of your content. Then you've got your backup space. Then you've got your DR space. It becomes quite expensive. And these virtual machines are very big, so it's not like moving your Active Directory to a hoster. It's a very small machine. If we've got a number of SharePoint machines, as we'll see the size of them, they're very big. They don't play nicely in an over-committed VMware environment, and most hosters will think they're going to get like a 5-to-1 ratio of virtual machines to a physical machine. That doesn't work in the SharePoint space. And obviously you need to think about your network redundancy in case you lose that connection if you're going for private cloud. One of the things I didn't put on here I think is good about the private cloud is it lets you more easily delegate application management. You could outsource that very easily, and we do this for quite a few customers where it's much easier in this sort of environment for us to come in and manage SharePoint for the customer because we don't see the rest of their infrastructure. We're just coming in through a back door to manage the SharePoint farm for the customer. It's really, really easy to do. We're not having to be domain admins. We're not VPNing into their internal network. We'd normally have some kind of back door into managing this SharePoint environment that's hosted by some other hosting provider that really is just providing the tin, the power, and the cooling. Another option for then hosting is not only Azure. I'm going to put that up because Microsoft like it when we talk about their hosting options, but I know a lot of people use Amazon as well for hosting virtual machines. Really, really good in the test environment. With Azure, there's a bunch of things you have to be careful about. If you just provision all these virtual machines, you might find some performance issues. You've got to think about, bursting. So by default, SQL Server's not in Azure, probably not going to perform fast enough for SharePoint if you're putting a lot of content in it without you making quite a few changes. Now, I did a whole lot of work on, researching. There's great PowerShell scripts for provisioning your Azure hosted SharePoint environment to get it all set up. But just last week, Microsoft went and announced that they would now, with a push of a button, provision a whole SharePoint farm for you in Azure. And I'll talk about the costs. So it's great when you want to spin up a machine for a day for testing, but if you want to run it in production, and this was what I researched about a month or 2 months ago on the costing, just to have one web front end, one app server, one SQL server, and my domain controller was going to cost me with discounts $15,000 a year. That was just for one of each server. So if I wanted some redundancy, double that. I'd still like to buy a piece of tin myself. I can't get out of that habit. But yeah, so expensive. But what Microsoft have done, which is kind of cool, is screen res. What's going on there? I'll just go and show you this. So with Azure now, you can go straight into the Azure portal and you can say, I want to build myself, I don't know if anyone's seen this, but really quite nice. Sorry, I'm just going to, screen scale's gone funny. So yeah, I can go and create myself a SharePoint farm. It couldn't be easier. Except at the moment they were hiding the price when I tried this morning. So I can go and put in some standard details for my SharePoint farm and say whether I want a small farm or a medium farm, and it will go off and create it for me. Really quite impressive. And so really the production farm is this model here. This is what you get. You get high availability SQL Server always on capability with that model. I would love it if someone would tell me what the price for them running this environment would be. So don't know what it is, but I'd imagine I'm up for a good 40 or 50K a year. But it's definitely a hosting option that I could use. So really, what we're coming to is why we're here today, which is for the on-premise deployment. Where you've got your own infrastructure, you've probably already had VMware for years, and you're going to deploy SharePoint on-premise to get all the benefits of, you pick all your own features that you want to do, whether they're custom features or your own. You've got full control over how you're going to host that, whether you're going to have one dedicated VMware environment to host this on, or you're going to spread the different servers across your VMware environment and have anti-affinity, so you make sure you've got one web front end on one VMware server and one on the other, and they're not going to magically appear on the same server. You do have to obviously think about your staff capability. SharePoint doesn't just stand on its own. Obviously affects the DBA, the VMware administrator, the SAN administrator, if you have those kind of roles, Active Directory. So it involves a lot of staff to host SharePoint. You've got to really think about your DR requirements, and what I find with a lot of customers, they've invested in some magic black box DR solution, whether SAN-based or VMware-based, some other backup product. They say, don't worry about it, we just snapshot machines, they magically appear in the DR location, they magically work. They magically don't work usually with SharePoint, unless you can shut down SharePoint, snapshot everything within a millisecond. A lot of those solutions don't work. I'm a great fan of not losing the user's data, so log shipping is still my preferred method of providing good DR to another farm. But just realize that a lot of existing DR solutions don't work well for SharePoint. Obviously, you can do custom development for on-premise, much easier than doing it in the cloud. I know we've got apps, and everyone's talking about apps. Apps are a version 1 thing. We all know what people say about betting your business on version 1. There's always going to be a few early adopters, but I'm hanging out for version 2. It's certainly getting better, and it's not like the old days where you had to wait till version 3 with this, changes happening every 3 or 6 months. I'm sure things are going to improve, but certainly still a few challenges there. It's definitely getting better though. And the ability to deploy third-party features, whether this is document management add-ons, everything right down to web parts or widgets, you can still deploy most 2010 kind of solutions, still work on 2013 as well. So on one hand, Microsoft did a huge amount of work to make it really easy to do things like upgrade 2010 on-premise and still run your 2010 solutions, but none of that was relevant for the cloud. So I think apps, cloud, my intranet, my on-premise document management system, I'm not that likely to be running apps at the moment. I can see certainly in the future that's going to start happening. So while we're here, how many servers do I need, and why I called our New Zealand requirements a tiny farm? This is Microsoft's model for the small farm. Don't really get into the detail of it, but you're really 6 hosts and 14 VMs. I'd hate to think what the licensing for all of that is, but that's ideal, and that's if you've got 1 to 10 million items in SharePoint and you want good search out of that, search being one of the big impacts on 2013 that I'll spend a bit of time on. But we find most of our customers are really in the 500,000 to 1 million items that are actually in their SharePoint store. Some go over that, but from the infrastructure point of view, a lot of the demand on the servers is around search. So search in 2013, I'm sure everyone's heard about it. It's not just fast, it's really something new, but it takes probably about 60% of what fast was, about 20% of what SharePoint 2010 provided for search, and there's 20% of new stuff in there as well. So there's quite an overhead that we'll go over some of the decision points around how we're going to facilitate search, which leads us on to what really changed in 2013 that's really going to impact our topology design that we have to think about. So farms scale more than ever. One of the first things Microsoft do, my knowledge from working in Microsoft, was that when they think about what are we going to do for the next version, the first thing they have to focus on is what was the deployment blockers for the previous version. Why wouldn't people deploy SharePoint 2010? And it was really the really large customers struggled. If you had 100,000 employees, there were some problems with SharePoint 2010. So Microsoft put a huge amount of effort into that. They introduced some new capability for scaling. So the footprint of a SharePoint farm is now bigger. Even if you've only got 200 users, we've got a bigger footprint. We need more resources, more capacity to run the farm, even if we have 1 user. Okay, so there's a bigger footprint required. That's a tax on us in New Zealand, unfortunately, because we didn't need some of that scalability. We didn't actually need the Distributor Case for a New Zealand-sized organisation, but now we have to have it, and it takes resources. So Microsoft provided a huge amount of scaling. We could go up from 250,000 site collections, really, in our farm, up to 750,000 And I've got plenty of customers with 4,000 or 5,000 site collections. That's really easy to manage if you've got some good information architecture. Pretty common for us to have that many, but certainly nowhere up at the 250,000, let alone 750,000. Number of content databases from 300 up to 500, and from 5,000 sites in a content database to 10,000 sites in a content database. Great if you had 100,000 employees and wanted to give them all of my site. The old way, I wouldn't do that now, I'd use the cloud. But one of the key things most people don't realize, you read all of those Microsoft software boundaries and limitations, about how many items in a list, how many documents in a library. They don't tell you this, but all of those things assume you're using SQL Server Enterprise Edition. So how many people here are using SQL Server Standard? Okay, at least half. The rest are using Enterprise? Okay, so it's pretty good. It's probably improving. More and more people buying Enterprise, but I know a lot of people stick with SQL Server Standard. So that really means you need to have a lot of those Microsoft guidelines. And I'll cover off some of the differences between SQL Standard and Enterprise, because it has a big impact on SharePoint. So the other thing around this designing for better kind of service level agreements and the topology, by bringing out or introducing this request management and distributed cache. I don't know anyone using request management. It's a version 1 thing, seemed a bit dodgy, took a lot of overhead. Is anyone using request management? No, you don't need it for New Zealand size organisations. And the distributed cache actually has a couple of really useful features. One of them is if you're load balancing, you don't need sticky sessions anymore. Because everything's in the cache, if you move to another host, the other host can still get your data. It's a bit of a misnomer that it's distributed. The Azure distributed cache service is what the SharePoint distributed cache runs on, but it doesn't distribute the data across all the nodes in the cache. Your data is only in one of the nodes. So some tricky operations things. If you want to shut down a node, you need to first of all shut down the distributed cache so that all the data gets transferred to another node in the cache, which kind of something a lot of people aren't aware of. But in most New Zealand organisations, we'll be running that distributed cache actually on our front-end servers. There's no point running a separate whole SharePoint server license just to run our distributed cache on. And this kind of specialised workload area is where we're going to spend a bit of time on search and look at what some of the things are we have to consider with search. And now Microsoft instead of the application server, they call it the batch processing kind of layer. All the batch processing we do, it'd be great if we could get more of our timer jobs. That's usually where we consider our central admin server is running. For New Zealand, we'd be putting a lot of the search stuff down into batch processing layer around crawling and content processing, and just leaving the querying up on the web front end. But really, some of the scale out issues for New Zealand are licensing. Yes, Microsoft would love it if you ran 16 SharePoint servers, because it's about, I don't know, must be about 10K a server. So you can see, scaling out gets pretty expensive on the licensing model. And the more servers you've got, there's a lot more network communication going on between the servers. Whether it's the service application, proxies, working out what servers they can talk to, or just the fact that you're only running a particular service on one server, that the front-end servers are then going to have to talk to that. So one of the things that happens often with scale-out is that you need to think about, rather than just plugging all your servers into one switch, actually dual homing your servers, so that things like the back-end server to SQL Server traffic is not on the same switch as the users connecting to the front-end servers. If you want to improve the throughput, that's a great way of doing it. So, and scale-up issues really come down to usually virtualization issues, and it used to be more also the licensing, the addition of Windows you used. That's kind of not as relevant now with 2012, but certainly most people's VMware environments are overcommitted. I know I get the odd customer where they say, no, don't worry about it, we've got all these brand new VM hosts, and so you're going to be the only servers on it. By the time we've finished deploying our servers, there's also magically another couple of hundred servers on there as well. And when I say overcommit, we're talking about the number of logical cores needed for all the virtual machines versus the physical cores. And because SharePoint has a minimum of 4 cores, normally in a farm, SharePoint will not work with less than 4 cores because you don't get enough threads, enough ASP.NET threads. And you'll often find issues. So that's why Microsoft say for a single SharePoint server, even for a developer, you really need 6 cores just to get the thing up and running. Because there's so many processes running when that one user hits a web page that might have this, the content by search web part on it and some other web parts. And even the welcome and your name at the top of the screen has quite a big overhead because it's going and checking the user profile services. It's amazing that actually SharePoint works when you hit a web page. I'm always astounded. If you turn on the developer dashboard and see how much goes on behind the scenes just to render that page, it's amazing. So yeah, and virtualization I think is the big area that if you're building a big SharePoint farm, it can cause some issues to your VMware environment. Surprisingly, Hyper-V is slightly more friendly with the overcommit scenario than VMware is. But happy to talk about that in more detail if you're interested. It's one of my passions about understanding how the Windows kernel works, when you virtualize it. So the distributed cache, which is this new component, which by default when you install SharePoint, it installs a distributed cache on every server in your farm. That's just the default behavior. There is an option in the command line when you run setup to say don't install the distributed cache on this particular server, but by default it's on, and you probably haven't got much choice. If you've got 1 or 2 servers in your farm, you're going to be running the distributed cache service on those servers. Now it defaults to grabbing some memory, 5% of the memory. By the time the distributed cache is started, it looks at how much memory is left on the server, grabs 5% of it, which is not ideal on a small machine. Doesn't quite give you enough distributed cache size if you've, say, got 1,000 users. So what my recommendation is for New Zealand size organisations, manually set the distributed cache size to 1 gig, and bear in mind it's going to use up to 2 times that. So there's an overhead in the distributed cache and it can use up to twice that amount of memory. So now I've said, okay, I'm going to set it to 1 gig. That's 2 gigs of RAM I need to account for on my web front-end server before we've even got a web application running. And most of web applications are still the same as 2007, 2010. Each web application should allocate a good 2 gigs of RAM for by the time it's been running for a day, with maybe 300 or 400 users that have hit that web front end. Your actual web application hosting your internet is going to have used up maybe 2.5 gigs of RAM. Your My Site web application will have used up, maybe about 2 gigs of RAM as well. If someone goes and hits your central admin site and that happens to be on your web front end because you chose to do that, that's probably going to use another 500 megs of RAM, and then we get into search, which we'll cover as I keep saying, if I don't run out of time. And one thing I often see is if you've got the traditional 4-server farm, 2 web front ends, 2 application servers, often see this web message saying, this isn't good, you shouldn't have more than 3 distributed cache servers, take one out of the farm. And the idea is that you shouldn't be running it on the server that's running your crawling and content processing anyway. But if you use the default, Wizard installer or AutoSP installer, you'll have the distributed cache running on all your servers. And it kind of degrades when you've got 4 servers running the distributed cache. So definitely remove the distributed cache at least from the app server that's running your index and content processing. So what's the cache used for? And it has some really great uses. We didn't kind of really need it for New Zealand size organisations for performance, but it did mention it was good for the NLB scenario. But Microsoft's guidance, if you're a small farm, i.e. less than 10,000 users, 1 gig is, as I mentioned, you should set it to, but it will use up to double that. What Microsoft say is if you're hitting that 10,000 users, consider a dedicated server or 2 servers just to hold the distributed cache. And although it's the Azure, distributed cache service running on your own servers, it still has to have SharePoint running on those servers. So you're up for 2 more licenses to have high availability of your distributed cache running on dedicated servers. So 20 grand, I'd rather throw a bit more memory and maybe another 2 cores onto my 2 web front-end servers to save having to run dedicated distributed cache servers. But you've got to have a minimum of 1 in the farm. You can't actually turn off distributed cache altogether. Some things will not work, some things stop going. And there are a number of caches that SharePoint uses. So the distributed cache is just a service, and SharePoint creates a number of these caches. I mentioned that NLB affinity isn't required, and that helps us both with the logon performance as you move between web front ends. It's already cached your claim and all the AD groups that you belong to, so that's nice and fast. The activity feed is kind of the key thing. Microsoft built all these great social features. They started designing them in 2013 before they bought Yammer. So they did a huge amount of work for a really large organization. How can we make the performance when you went to your My Site page and it showed that activity feed? How could we make that respond very quickly? And that was by having it stored in memory in cache. So it's nice and fast. Search also benefits hugely from the distributed cache. all the queries users you often will find, if you look at your search query report, there's kind of the top 20 phrases represent 60% of your searches. And so by caching the result set from the searches, they speed up the search results web part dramatically. And some security trimming. And the Viewstate is a good one. I don't know if you've noticed this when you use the expand collapse web parts, group by, and you navigate to a page and you come back and it remembers, which one you've got expanded. That's really what's stored in what's called the view state. So every web part can store the state per user, what the current view information for that web part is. It's really just an ASP.NET feature. And now that gets stored in the distributed cache, so you can flop backwards and forwards between web servers, and the page remembers the view state of all the web parts on the page. But really the main thing that if you use the social features of SharePoint, which again for an intranet I think are still really, really good. I know Microsoft aren't going to invest in them, but I still think for an intranet and knowledge management they're slightly better than Yammer. That's just my personal preference. But there's these things that generate activities down the left-hand side, all the different things that can generate an activity which gets fed into the distributed cache, and people see those things through the feed. So what you've really got to consider here is if you shut down your server that's running the distributed cache and start it back up again, that output is empty for a while. There are some timer jobs, some processes that go through and rebuild the cache. Not everything gets put back in the cache. Things that can be reconstituted out of people's My Sites or site collections can be put back in the cache, but some stuff isn't stored there. The fact that you liked something or you ranked a document, while that's stored kind of long term, it won't get put back in the cache if I lose all of my distributed cache. So some people go, we restarted the farm and now we've got a web part on the homepage that says what's the most popular stuff, or the last 15 discussions from a social site, but they're not showing any responses, no comments back. And that'll be because you inappropriately shut down your entire distributed cache environment. So I'll move on to search quickly. We're doing quite well on time actually. I'm sure everyone's seen this diagram. I'm not going to go through all the steps, but just to talk about some of the specific things for each of these components that are going to impact our topology. So the crawl component. Most people think the crawl component is what does all the work. It does all the crawling, must be really important, and it was in 2010, and it's still the same component in 2013 and 2010, but all it does is go and gets the links, and then it passes those links on. It basically builds up a big database for us of all the links that content processing then has to go and process. So the crawling doesn't really do a huge amount. It's got to get access to the content to find items that have changed, but it's not really a huge overhead. And if you ever managed SharePoint 2010, we used to go in and define these things called crawl impact rules. We could say, don't go and get 8 documents at a time, only get 2 at a time, or get 1 at a time and wait 5 seconds between each document, and that's how we could control the impact of crawling on 2010. But you'll find if you try that on 2013, no impact. You're still going to be hitting 100% CPU while you're doing a full crawl. Has anyone noticed that? Full crawling, 100% CPU for hours on end. That's what happens. So it's really there's some other areas I'll show you where we can really have more control over the impact of indexing. And that's really this content processing component. And this is really the fast component. This gets that list of all the URLs that need to be crawled, and it starts hammering away, loading those documents in, doing entity extraction, looking for all the metadata inside the Word documents, you may have old I filters. Really nice. The indexing component has PDF indexing built in. You don't have to add any add-ons to do that now, which is really good. But this really is the thing that's both CPU and memory intensive. If you kick off a full crawl on your SharePoint farm, that box is going to be pegged at 100% until it's finished. And some IT administrators don't like that. No, I want to buy a V8 and pull half the spark plugs out. Only run it at 50%. Well, it's going to take twice as long. So I don't see the point in that. There is nothing wrong with your server running at 100%. But some people don't like it, and if that server is also trying to do other things, it's quite funny. This process actually runs at an elevated priority, so when it's running at 100%, it doesn't like giving up that processor. So that can cause some problems if other, especially interactive things that users are trying to do on that server, they just won't get a look in. And then there's analytics processing. So a big part of the ranking or the relevancy in SharePoint is based on how popular items are. So all the time in the background when you're clicking on documents, opening up documents in your site collections. Events are being fired through, and and SharePoint's working out how can I update my relevance of documents based on their popularity. And that's not self-fulfilling. So inside the search results, you click on a document, that doesn't count to its popularity if it's already, in a web part showing the most popular items. That doesn't count for it. The index component, this is kind of the middleman. This thing also can get hammered pretty heavily. So we've got the content processing trying to update our index, especially when you're doing a full crawl, and we've got users trying to execute searches, doing queries. They're also trying to access this index component. So this one, also can generate some high CPU, and there's certain events that can happen in search, which I'll cover off, that can really cause some issues for this if it's running on a server that's running other things as well. And then we've got query processing. This is really what the end users do. They go to the search page, they put in a query that they want, and the query processing component is going to go and look up the index and work out magically what's the right kind of stuff to return to the user. So it needs access to the index, which is a key thing. If our index is really heavily being used by content processing, updating it, what kind of response are users going to get trying to do searches? We like to brag about search. We like to say, look at that, 100,000 results came back in 0.1 of a second. All of a sudden you might find, it takes 5 seconds for the results to come back. What could be causing that? There is a search admin component. This caused a bit of confusion. We've found it has to be running on, if we separate out some of our search components, has to run on more than one server. I'll show you a diagram of that. But really the key one I mentioned around search was the server running at 100%, especially if you're trying to squash your SharePoint farm down to 1 or 2 servers. This is really going to be a serious problem. And I mentioned that you can't just set the crawler impact rules. Shouldn't have been crawl priority, crawler impact rules. What really happens out of the box is that content processing component has a default rule that says create 3 threads per core. So we've got a 4-core machine, we're going to have 12 threads going and grabbing those documents based on the crawler that gave us all the URLs we need to crawl. We're now going to go and get 12 documents at a time and start processing them to work out what are all the words in them, what are the metadata tags in them, what entity extraction. And out of the box, SharePoint's going to do date entity extraction, and you may have set up company entity extraction. It also does this nominal author entity extraction as well. So it's quite processor intensive. And these 12 threads running on your 4-core machine, trust me, it's going to be running at 100%. If you've got a terabyte of content, that'll be a good 12 hours on a 4-core machine that nothing's going to get a look at. It's going to be absolutely hammered. I'm surprised not everybody's nodding. I see a few people nodding. But we've found this certainly for a lot of our SharePoint farms of about 1,000 users. As soon as probably you go over 500 users, this really becomes an issue. And what we've found, you can set it down to 1 thread per processor. And then the box sits at about 50 or 60%, but it could take us 24 hours to do a full crawl of our terabyte of content. So we found 2. It's kind of the choice. It's 1, 2, or 3. 2 is good. It will be peaking at 100% quite a lot, but we'll get the odd breather in there. We'll still get our content index in about the same amount of time as 3 threads. Might take a couple of hours longer. But it seems to work, and it doesn't absolutely hammer the machine and cause other things to start timing out. So that's a recommendation certainly that I have to, if you've got a dedicated application server for crawling, set that to 2. If you've got the shared server, like one server you're trying to be a developer, and people would say turn off search, but then I'm trying to use the query by search web part, so search needs to be running. You can set that to 1, because every now and again you do want to kick off a crawl, or even your incremental crawl if you go and drag and drop a couple of 100 documents into SharePoint. Now that Microsoft made that so easy to do, your incremental crawl all of a sudden is going to be picking up these documents and processing them. So simple PowerShell command, set it to 1 or set it to 2, monitor then your search, kick off a full crawl and see what happens. But you will notice the difference if you drop that number down. As I said, specifying how many documents to crawl really has no impact, because it still populates this table, and if you look at the report on your indexing, it shows it takes about 5 minutes to populate 80 to 100,000 links in this table, and then the content processor starts going and grabbing those based on the number of threads that are running. Now, the other thing that's new in 2013 is this concept called continuous crawl, and everyone talks about it because it's fantastic, isn't it? Everyone agree continuous crawl? It's got some great benefits. The benefits are if you're driving your user experience based on the content by search web part, as soon as someone adds a page somewhere, you want it to appear in a web part saying, hey, here's some content. And what content continuous crawl was really designed for was, again, Boeing or someone like that with 100,000 employees. There's probably a few thousand documents, every half hour being added to SharePoint. So the idea of continuous crawl is we can go every 5 minutes and say, let's start doing an incremental crawl. And once we've started that, we find out all the new links and then we start crawling them. But then 5 minutes after that, even more content's been added, but we won't know about that in a normal incremental crawl until we get round to the next incremental crawl. So continuous crawl is great if your incremental crawl would take more than 15 minutes to complete normally. Now, what I've found for most customers with about 1,000 people, about 1 terabyte of content, it takes 5 to 7 minutes to do an incremental crawl. So that's based on there being maybe 5% of content change would be the very top end that you would ever get, in probably a day, let alone in a 5 or 15 minute increment. So you've really got to go, do we really need incremental crawl? Sorry, do we really need continuous crawl if I could set my incremental crawl to every 15 minutes? I haven't yet found a customer where I can't set incremental crawl to 15 minutes and not have any overlapping. Even if I set my incremental crawl to 5 minutes and it took 7 minutes to do the incremental crawl, there's only 2 minutes that I'm missing out on new content for because the incremental crawls just end up going back to back. So if your incremental crawl overlaps, the next incremental crawl just waits till the last one's finished. So the big issue really here is incremental crawl is great, and the way it works is a really good diagram that shows you the time over when content changes and how it gets crawled. But what really happens is search has all of these different catalogs. It actually has a catalog in memory for all the really, really recent stuff, but then it creates this file system based on 5 layers deep of catalog files. And it's really based on differences. So we'll end up with, as new content is added, we create these buckets down the bottom of new content. And as soon as the difference between all of these buckets and the level above, the parent, is more than 20%, SharePoint has to merge all of the content from the buckets at the bottom level, level 1, up to level 2. Then when all of our level 2 layers in that bucket are more than 20% different than level 3, we do another merge. So this merging is very both I/O and processor intensive. So these are physically files sitting on the file system that search is managing. So, and it's unpredictable when these merges are going to happen. They're just going to happen when the difference is 20%. So all of a sudden and this is happening on the index itself. So wherever we host the index, there's going to be all this processing going on that we have no control over when it's going to happen. So my preference is to stick with incremental crawling unless you really understand why you need continuous crawl. Incremental crawl only has 2 catalogs, two files on the file system, 0 and 1. One of them is being used by the query, the other one is being used by the content processing to update the index. When that incremental crawl is finished, SharePoint just tells the query service, oh, now flip over and use this other index. We've got 2 indexes, only one of them is being updated by the content processing and the other one's being used by query. It's really, really simple. It's a flip-flop thing. And not nearly as much overhead as continuous crawl is. And that's only when we've got one server running the catalog. If we then got an index partition and we're for high availability copying that over, there's bigger overhead as well. So again, don't just go turn that on without understanding whether you really need it, because incremental crawl does the job for most New Zealand organisations. So what we then end up is looking at our search topology. I've got a couple of slides around the wrong way here, but the traditional kind of thought of 2 web front-end servers, 2 application servers, kind of still works in New Zealand for 2013. Sometimes it's not always the right model, but it still kind of works, and we can distribute our search components accordingly. So I've got 2 app servers in this scenario. One of them really is what I would have called my indexing server, but it's now my indexing, content processing, and it has a copy of the index partition on it. But when it's busy content processing and updating that index partition, I've got a replica of the index partition on the other app server. And that's good. So then web front ends, which are only running the query role, can still, I'm going to guarantee they're going to get a look into the other index partition. They're going to get good response back from it. Users' searches will still work really well. The first 2013 4-server farm I built, I put the index partition on the web front end servers. I thought, oh, that's that's good. I got query and index partition. And I found that when we were doing a full crawl, search response took 5 to 10 seconds because the query component couldn't get a look into the index partition even though it was running on the same physical box. So we learned very quickly to go with this model. Search still worked well because the service application proxy knows how to do the load balancing. That's a magic thing in SharePoint, that load balancing of service applications. And there's a really good TechNet article on how that works. It's brilliant. You don't have to worry about it. It magically does it. The web front ends know which server is going to give good response for getting search results back. So just thinking, so that covered off search. Thinking about some of our non-functional requirements, really got to think about how many users. And when people talk about users, is this, concurrent users, active users? That number really gets back to how many requests per second are we looking at, wanting from our web front ends, the things servicing the user requests. And that also is going to come down to the workload. Then we talk about availabilities. For probably half the customers in New Zealand, they want availability, which is why they want 2 web front-end servers or think they want 2 web front-end servers, not for performance. I mean, I can get a good 40 requests per second out of a web front-end. That would be 400 concurrent users. That might be the equivalent of 4,000 people in an organisation. As long as I'm not using dodgy custom code, and because I don't like developers, I don't usually let custom code go on my server, but you can get a lot of performance with a bit of tweaking out of one SharePoint web front-end server. So when we talk about availability, do we need 2 web front-end servers? Again, we've got VMware high availability. When did you last see Windows blue screen? I see more VMware. What colour's the VMware crash? Purple, yep. I see more of those at the moment than I see Windows blue screens. But I'm a great fan of just raw crash recovery. I mean, even down to SQL Server, it recovers so well. I mean, I've only had one case, I think, where I had a corrupt content database that went offline when SQL restarted. But for me, if I had, maybe twice a year, I had a 5-minute web front-end crash and it took 5 minutes for VMware to restart it on another host, that's actually pretty cheap, high availability. I've saved myself a whole SharePoint web front-end server license. As long as it only happens once or twice a year, I'm not going to lose my job and I save the company money. But again, if you're up to the 1,000 users, you probably do need those 2 web front ends. That's 1,000, active users on the server every day. You probably do need the 2 web front ends unless you can go for something like an 8-core web front end server. And that doesn't work well in VMware environments. So for your availability, you're going to look at network load balancing for your web front ends. Windows NLB doesn't really cut it. It's kind of not really web front end. It's not proper load balancing. If one of your web front ends goes down, half your users still are losing access to SharePoint for quite a while. So you're looking at some other hardware or software load balancer outside of Windows, or think about VMware crash recovery, or Hyper-V. How many people here use Hyper-V? Yeah, good. There's a few. Talk later if I have time left about some of the benefits of VMware over Hyper-V over VMware. The key thing is for recovery, snapshots are no good unless you shut down all the servers in your farm. Snapshot will work on one machine, although what I've been seeing lately is there's a bit of a randomness that if you're snapshotting SharePoint VMs somewhere, sometimes SharePoint hangs. And I've seen this on a couple of customers now that we've actually stopped doing VMware snapshots. One, because we can't restore them anyway, unless we'd shut down the machines beforehand. So restoring a VMware snapshot of one SharePoint server in your farm is probably going to break search first of all, and it's probably going to break a few other things. So don't even bother trying it unless it's your test environment and you want to snapshot it before you try Service Pack 1 upgrade. But still shut down Windows first before you do the snapshot. It just doesn't work. I stick with DR. If you want to do things like split farms or think you can do mirroring or high availability with geographic distribution, you've got to have a millisecond latency between everything that makes up your farm. So most people don't get a millisecond between buildings, let alone, unless you've got fibre direct between your buildings. Do have a couple of customers that have that and can actually run a split farm, but most people can't. And really think about what is it we're going to recover from. Is it going to be host failure or virtual machine failure? And as I say, I see a lot less virtual machine failure nowadays and a lot more host failure or SAN failure. Story from one customer, we built a brand new 2013 farm, we left. 2 days later the SAN went belly up before they'd managed to do a snapshot and they lost everything. So those sort of things do happen. So really thinking about what are you trying to protect against. And really thinking about the workload. So it's not, and this is also for performance testing, it's not just about the browser, right? The biggest load on SharePoint for most organizations, if you're using it for document management, is Office, not the browser. Okay, the browser scales massively, but especially in 2010, when you had lots and lots of Office users and Outlook connected to SharePoint, generated more load probably than the browser did. Now, Microsoft did a lot of work in 2010 on the client, how the client communicated to SharePoint, and in 2013 they've done a lot of work on how SharePoint communicates to SQL Server. So it does now, it's probably, they've reduced the load on SQL Server probably by about 50% now when you're doing document management through that shredded storage. So that's really good. You've got to, in your scenario, when we come to work out how many servers do we need, which servers are going to host what roles, it really is what is the workload we're doing. If you're doing just an intranet, it's completely different from doing document management, which is also completely different for doing BI. But now what we find, of course, is everyone's trying to do all of those things on the SharePoint farm. So now it becomes quite a balancing act. And so sometimes the traditional, two web front-end servers and an app server may not be relevant. I've got quite a few customers where we're doing this vertical stack, one server for each role, a web front-end server, a search server running the catalog, another search server doing the content processing, and another SharePoint server doing our BI roles, running reporting services and Power Pivot and Power View. And that's a better model for them. They've still got 4 servers, but now they're allocating to the roles and relying on VMware crash recovery to recover in the case something dies, rather than having high availability through, duplicate roles where we don't really need the capacity of those servers, but we're paying for the licensing. So sometimes better to move away from the traditional model and go for that dedicated role per server. The web front ends generally will have slightly lower requests per second than in 2010 if you're running all these other things on the server like Distributor Case, so there's more activity going on the server, so you get slightly less performance out of a web front end, and generally that probably holds true. And then you've got to take into account what are the other features or enterprise features you want to run on your farm. So we're not just talking about our intranet and our document management. Magically we might go, yeah, there's this new 2013 workflow, we should have it. And this is another one, I disagree with this. I don't think most people on premise should really consider deploying 2013 workflow initially. One, when you install SharePoint, it only comes with 2010 workflow out of the box. So you install your brand new 2013 server, you get SharePoint 2010. If you go into a document library and turn on the approval workflow out of the box, it only uses SharePoint 2010 workflow. It does not use 2013 workflow. I don't know if people are aware of that. But workflow is an add-on. You have to add it onto your SharePoint farm afterwards. It takes a whole bunch of resources. It really shouldn't even be part of your SharePoint farm. It should be a workflow farm. It doesn't even have SharePoint installed on it. All you do on SharePoint is install the workflow manager component and some PowerShell commands to link up and say where is your workflow going to run, very similar to Office Web Apps. It's a whole different farm. You have to manage it separately. That has a couple of challenges as well. But I have a document that's up on the Yammer site for this session where I've put a little white paper up on why I think 2013 workflow you need to consider. Do you need to install it? There's about 20 common workflow tasks that you want to do in SharePoint that 2013 workflow can't do. It can't publish something. So you'd think if I wanted to publish a page, I'd be able to do that in 2013 workflow, but you can't. So I've got a list of about 20 things that you probably do today on 2010 that you can't do in 2013 without the 2010 workflow. So unless you identify those couple of things that 2013 are good at that you really want, which is just calling web services and having, iterating through all the items in a library, it can do that sort of thing really well, but quite a lot of overhead to get it running. And you look at products like Nintex 2013 on-premise, it only needs the 2010 workflow engine. It doesn't, if you put 2013 on, Nintex doesn't take any advantage of it. So you've got to really, don't just jump in and say, yes, we've got to deploy that as well until you understand what your requirements are that would drive needing that. Apps is the other one. On your intranet, would you really want to be using apps? Now, there is one scenario coming up where you probably do need the apps infrastructure on your server, but that's not about SharePoint, that's about Office apps. If you want a catalog so that your internal users can start deploying Excel add-ins that are apps, not com add-ins, then you need an app store on-premise, and SharePoint can provide that for you. That would be about the only time I would deploy it on-premise. I don't think I'd be really at the moment wanting my end users downloading apps from the Microsoft App Store. And also if I was developing some line of business application, I'm still not sure whether I'd build it as in the new app model or just build a traditional, WSP solution, or in fact just host in an iframe, which that's all an app really is at the end of the day. Enterprise development, JavaScript and iframes. Not many developers here, obviously. So that's my beef about apps. Anyway, the BI features. So if you're going to start deploying these, SQL Server reporting services, since 2008, really, Microsoft said the reporting dashboard, if you've ever used that in native mode, is dead. They updated the icons on it, and that's about it. But they really said SharePoint is the UI for reporting services. And with 2010, if you added the 2008 R2 reporting services add-on, it became a proper service application. In 2013, it's only a service application. You can still choose whether you're going to run, 2008 R2, 2012 or 2012 R2 reporting services on that. But the report engine itself takes quite a bit of processing grunt to render the reports, and it needs to run on a SharePoint server. So you're either going to run it on a dedicated SharePoint server for running reports, or consider that really it is a front-end task. It's not really an app server. Reports, although they're going to be rendered in a web part, it's more a front-end process now if you're running interactive reports. So you'd almost think about scaling out the web front-end to handle the load, which is more about processor and memory, than having a dedicated back-end server for some of these things. SSRS, Excel services, if you're enterprise, Performance Point, PowerPoint, Power Pivot, Power View. It's getting a bit crazy, isn't it? Or just stick with Excel web apps, which are quite cool and come with Office web applications. So what would be the overhead in our farm of using those? And access services. As I mentioned, I would not deploy access services on my internal farm. I'd seriously consider using the hybrid model, especially if I had an enterprise agreement. You can get that so cheap if I wanted to start deploying access apps. Kind of the only thing I think missing at the moment from access apps is remote event receivers. I can hook up reporting services to access services because they live in their own SQL database, which is quite good. Especially if you put them up in Azure, you can get access to that database, you can run reporting on it, but you don't get triggers or remote event receivers. I think as soon as Microsoft add the ability to hook in a remote event receiver to my access app, I could build real business applications on that platform. The other one's the work management service. This is the thing that kind of rolls up through into Outlook, all the tasks that you might have been assigned in a SharePoint site, or seeing in SharePoint all the tasks that you've got in Outlook. It does require some integration between Exchange 2013 and SharePoint 2013. So again, this doesn't work in the hybrid model because you don't get the ability to set up the OAuth that's required between an on-premise and in the cloud server. But certainly if you're running Exchange 2013 on-premise and SharePoint 2013 on-premise, this work management service is something that's worth considering putting together. You can really do like the poor man's project management solution now with the SharePoint site template for doing projects, and then rolling up tasks across all the project sites so that in a person's My Site, they see all the tasks allocated to them across site collections. They also see it in Outlook. It's really quite powerful. Unfortunately, that is where I think people would be silly doing Exchange 2013 on-premise. That's the one you should move to the cloud. It's asynchronous. Doesn't matter if it takes 5 minutes for an email to get to your colleague sitting next to you. Whereas for SharePoint, it does matter if it takes 5 minutes to open up your project plan from SharePoint. So what impact does all of that have on your topology as well, you need to consider. So the components. Office web applications are not actually a SharePoint component, but you'd be mad to not install them with SharePoint. They light up in search so that people can preview the document by hovering over it in the search results rather than the 2010 where you had to really open every single document. So they're great. So they should really be part of your SharePoint farm, even though they're a different server or servers. The distributor case, you're going to have it. So you're going to at least have it on your web front-end servers. It's going to gobble up a good 2 gigs of RAM, so factor that in. I have my own in my head. I go, 2 gigs for the OS, 2 gigs for each web application. I'm going to have at least 2 of those. That's 4 gigs, 2 gigs for the distributed cache. Another couple of gigs for all the search stuff that's going on. So the query component's going to easily take 2 gigs of RAM. And that's why Microsoft say a minimum of 12 gigs of RAM. I didn't put my pictures in here, but I've built farms with 2 gigs of RAM, and they use 100% of the memory. And of course then IT goes, oh, 100% memory being used, we can't have that, we need to add more memory. I say, okay, let's up it to 16 gigs. And then we up it to 16 gigs and it's still running at 12 gigs of RAM. I said, okay, same as buying the V8 and pulling two of the spark plugs out. That's all you've done. You're paying in your VMware environment now for this extra 4 gigs of RAM, which we're never going to use, but you wanted it there as a buffer. That's fine, you can do that. The key thing to look for in the memory is the hard page faults. And so I've had machines with, 50 megabytes of free memory, that's what it says in the performance monitor, but no page faults. You might get a page fault, every 30 seconds, and it's only a couple of page faults, so it's not an issue. The web role, obviously we're going to be placing that on our web front-end servers, but the search roles, where are we going to place those? We've got our query, our index partition, content processing, crawling, analytics, admin. We've got to decide where we're going to put those components, then all going to put those. So in our topology, our choices, this single server, great for developers, great for maybe a sandpit. You get this up and running so that BAs and the intranet team have got something to play with while you're busy trying to get all the capacity and infrastructure you need for your real farm. So good for up to 50 users. I've had a few pilots and training sessions and stuff done on a single server, but this is that 6 gigs of RAM, 24 gig of memory machine. Otherwise it will just barf when certain things happen, especially full crawling of content. And then we can go through various iterations around, and this could be a single server for database, our batch processing, or mainly all of our search components, and our front-end server. In New Zealand, there'd be very few people, I think, that use either the routing or the caching as a dedicated layer. They're going to put the caching, distributor cache on the web front-end servers. But that 2 servers plus SQL server is good for 250 users. As soon as you're heading up towards the 1,000 users, you will have that kind of 4-server environment. Although if you had a huge amount of content and a smaller number of users, you might split those 2 batch processing ones to be specifically targeted for the index partition and the content processing running on 2 different servers rather than having the high availability. And then we go up to, and there would be people between, maybe in the 10 to 20,000 users. We've got some DHBs and other organizations that have a lot of users, but they're more consumers rather than producers of content. So sometimes you don't need this, but thinking about putting the search roles on their own. Now I wouldn't have 2 for each of them, I'd have 1 myself, because remember, each one of these is a SharePoint server license, depending on your licensing, somewhere between probably about 7 and 10 or 12K, so it adds up very quickly. But we'll probably never see anything more than that in New Zealand. Maybe even for 20,000 users, it would be fine for between that 1 to 10 million documents. That's the sort of environment you'd be looking at. And then there might be some specialized roles. So things like reporting services. I presume everyone knows if you want high availability on reporting services, you have to allocate SQL Enterprise licenses to 2 of your SharePoint servers to get NLB for reporting services. Otherwise, you're only going to have one single server in your farm that can run reporting services. So what a normal topology that we've found and how we've distributed the search roles in particular. We've got our web front ends at the top running the query role for search. We've got also Office Web App servers which have to be a separate server. You cannot run them now on the same server as SharePoint. And we'd spread those obviously across different physical hosts. And then we've got our crawl, admin, content processing, and really our main index partition on one of those application servers, replicating the index partition to the other server so that when our first application server is really, really busy, the query components can still access the copy of the index partition on the other server. And I move the analytics component, which is really just a batch processing thing, onto that other server as well. And that makes for a pretty good farm, support 1,000 users, terabyte of content, search results, within certainly under a second. Everything seems to perform really well for 1,000 users with that sort of environment. Now another one that you might notice here as well, no SQL Server cluster. So for me nowadays, the SQL clustering is really a Windows thing. SQL is only cluster aware. There's no such thing really as a SQL cluster. It's a Windows cluster with SQL running on it and SQL being aware. But the problem with a normal cluster, I've still only got 1 copy of the data. And what I really want to protect is corruption of the data, not corruption of Windows. It's not NT4 anymore or Windows 2000 where you'd reboot the server every week because it would become unreliable. When did you last see SQL crash because there was a SQL bug? I actually can't remember SQL crashing. Yeah, the old Windows crash, normally because there's some driver problem. But I find nowadays I find it better to put my effort into log shipping that data to a DR location or some other location so I can use that data kind of offline than worrying about a Windows cluster. Certainly if you've got SQL Enterprise and you're going to consolidate all your different apps onto different instances of SQL, go for high availability. That's fine. It's a bigger IT overhead, more things to manage. You still have a few issues in that environment. If you want to failover, the difference between automatic failover and manual failover, there's quite a bit of operational things you've got to consider there. But there's nothing wrong nowadays with even 1,000 users having a good single SQL Server box to meet those requirements. You'll still easily meet your 99.99 availability. I say SQL is so good at recovering from a crash now. You start SQL up. One time, I think in the last 3 years, I've had one content database be offline because there was something wrong with it. And I did that bad thing of, just bring it online, ignore any lost transactions. I had no problems. So yes, you can put a cluster in, but it's not making your data highly available. Yep. Yeah. So yes, in SQL that's true, but if you have to put updates on SharePoint, you have to take the whole SharePoint farm down, so having the high availability SQL doesn't count because my farm is going offline anyway. While my farm's offline, I do my SQL update. Yeah, so that I've had that conversation myself, but unfortunately, regardless of what you do with SharePoint, you apply Service Pack 1, your whole farm's got to go down. That's where I've got my log shipped copy of SQL. I can stand up a single server, read-only, for the people that need access to the content on Saturday while I'm applying Service Pack 1 on my SharePoint farm and doing my SQL Server patches. So I just have an outage window to do all of that at once. Yeah. That was another question.
So I'm not a technical expert, but could you do aliasing on the log ship database service? Kind of do failover?
Well, manual failover, yes. So my definition then, I've got to finish in a moment, is my failover initially is read-only. The problem is if you fail over and make that DR copy read-write, you've got twice as big an outage to fail back. So that's really the issue with failover. Do it for read-only, and yeah, I lost track of my time. Only one and if people want to talk about this, SQL Standard versus Enterprise, and I think really the biggest implication here if you're using SQL Standard is the single thread. Doesn't matter how many cores you bought for SQL Server, only one thread is used for creating indexes, creating logs, doing DBCC, and that's a big one. If every night you do a backup and you do a DBCC first, it's going to be sequential. It's going to take a long time to get your backup done if you're doing a DBCC, check DB beforehand, which you should do. But that's probably the biggest benefit of going for SQL Enterprise is that your index defragmentation is done online instead of offline, so you're going to have a bigger outage without realizing it for each of your content databases sequentially every night if you do database maintenance. But Enterprise is more expensive. Yep.
From a SharePoint point of view, is there any advantages of SQL 2012 versus 2008 R2?
I'd have to say yes, but then between 2012 R2 and 2014, because remember that's out now, I'm not sure that there's that many differences between that one. But the shredded storage works on both, but certainly if you've got Enterprise, I'd be definitely going with 2012 rather than R2. Yep. Right. So I'm going to go to the speaker area because I'm sure people have got lots of other questions. And I did miss a couple of slides, but probably nothing, only two, so not too bad. Thank you very much for your time. Hopefully that was valuable, but as I say, I'll hang around up till lunchtime and be on the stand as well. Thank you.